And we've been really looking forward to this because we have a world-class presenter who's going to be talking with us about the circular economy and how it fits into agriculture. And I'm just thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce my friend and collaborating partner, Bruno Basso. Bruno, if you haven't read about him or heard about him, I think you're in for a special treat. He is the John A. Hanna Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University, a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Bruno integrates diverse disciplines to understand the spatial and temporal variabilities of crop yield and environmental outcomes in agricultural systems. He has been active across the state, the country, the world, in fact, working on circular bioeconomy and other climate-smart agriculture approaches and techniques. He's a recipient of multiple awards, and I think a couple of highlights is him being named a Fellow of the Soil Science Society of America and a Fellow of the American Society of Agronomy. He's also received the an MSU Innovation of the Year Award in 2016. So, Bruno, thank you for joining us. We have probably 35, maybe even 40 minutes for you to be helping us get our heads around what this circular bioeconomy is and how it relates to agriculture. And then we're going to go into a question and answer period. And what we'll do is invite you either to type questions into the chat or raise your hand and I'll look for you and we'll call on you. So with no further ado, Bruno, over to you and welcome again.
Perfect. You can see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Well, it's always a pleasure to be able to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this important topic. It is always a pleasure to be invited by Ernie because of the great things that he always puts together. So without much more comment on the intro, I think circular bioeconomy is going to play a critical role in the future going forward, and you'll see one of the reasons I think it will. Just briefly, I know I just couldn't skip some of the challenges, but this is the only slide that looks like more of a pessimistic in a way type of slide where, obviously we have the challenge of continue to grow nutritious food. It's not just about food security, but it's nutritional security, animal feed, fuel, and energy with less water and land that we have now under the threat of climate change. We need to protect soils, water, and quality biodiversity, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but most importantly, in a way, in order to see practice change and improvements happening on the farm, we need to be able to account for a potential revenue stream to farmers one way or another, whether it's from policy to incentivize the change or from people, market driven. The pictures below show basically that urbanization is on top of one of the causes of, we lose about 10,000 acres per day of agricultural land for urbanization on a global scale. That's pretty challenging because it just feeds back such a vicious cycle of more people moving into the city, more people looking for obviously better future opportunities. They have to eat, they tend to eat possibly low quality food. And so the feedback on that loop becomes significantly important. And it's, again, so many spillover effects of how we're losing some of the best land for urbanization. Even here in the US, a lot of the cities continue to have expansion of some of the most fertile ground. Deforestation, obviously, whether it's as a consequence of reduced yield, hopefully, likely for some of the crops, and yield continues to go up and should not lead to an increased indirect land use, but you still observe deforestation, forest land degradation, fires occur as a consequences of additional threats from climate and dryness and drought and so on. Soil erosion is a major environmental impact. We're still on a ballpark. We lose roughly about a pound of soil per bushel of corn that is produced, mostly occurring in the Midwest. And the water quality closer to where I live in Michigan is really a result of inappropriate chemical inputs used, excessive in places, and that leads to surface runoff, phosphorus and nitrogen affecting water resources and eutrophication and so on. So the major, you probably have seen this in a recent publication, just I know you're very familiar, but I wanted to separate how much climate is impacting the agricultural system with the different practices, and also where the global emission from the food system come. And so there is a component of on-farm energy use, emission from synthetic fertilizer as cultivation, a big chunk from enteric fermentation, manure management, crop residues. When you move into the food system, those percentage of what happens on the farm remain, but there is a big chunk also coming from indirect land use. Basically, an additional 50% comes from food processing. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because my focus of research and the talk is from the seed to the gate, from cradle to gate. I will not be discussing a lot of incredible opportunities that we could have in the food processing and transportation, packaging, and all that. So of the technical potential of those numbers, there are immediate, and the paper goes into details. I've, for myself, with colleagues, published a recent paper in PNAS where we talk about the possibility of, as you see on the graphics on the right, of how ideally, depending on the different type of technologies, if it's current, mid-term, or long-term, we could lead to a high level of recycling and circular bioeconomy by doing the right thing. So back on the graph on the left, we can reduce emission by improving on-farm energy use, which is pumping and all the true conservation tillages, and reduction of synthetic fertilizer through sustainable management, nitrogen fertilizer, alternative rice cultivation as a chunk, breeding technologies and additional amendments could reduce enteric fermentation, bioenergy, carbon and capture and storage, and then alternative as enhanced rock weathering, alternative approaches that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But my particular focus was again on understanding why different technologies could, lead to improvements of increased resource use efficiency. And I'm going to list, some of them to fulfill, the principle of circular bioeconomy. And so what we aim through the different technologies is to increase use efficiency, design out as much as possible waste and pollution, keep products and material in use into the recycling bin, and then regenerate natural system and provide an economic benefits. So some from when we deal on farm system, the key principle is, which is obviously depending on who you talk to, is challenging because it does require a change of management on the farm. And so promoting high diversity with alternative crops, high phase rotation, when we wouldn't just grow monoculture, but you rotate crops. Regenerative approaches like nutrient cycling, compost, manure, biodigestate as a result of the biodigester, which is fed with animal waste, food waste, alternative in between crops, potentially even part of the cover crops. We envision animal integration to be a critical piece of the bioeconomy because of, again, the possibility of recycling inputs and providing an economic benefits. Forever green cover crop, perennial agroforestry. Then I'll be focusing towards the end of the talk about this concept of precision conservation, on what we have been doing on identifying these constantly low yielding areas within fields, not just in one field, across the entire Midwest of the US, that would be basically automatically bring a significant level of efficiency across the system, because the current way it is managed is basically only losing money and environmental impact. And then promoting, obviously, no tillage as much as possible, low till, and precision technology for variable rate. Benefits are, first of all, you need to look at providing a farmer well-being and profitability, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, soil carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation with pollinators, soil health. And this brings, all these benefits spill into other sector. And so just want to make people aware of, the work that different agencies are doing on One Health, which is the health of the ecosystems, health of food, health of the farmers and the community, obtained through this approach, because it brings economics and better environmental integrity across all the different things you have seen, from biodiversity to improved soil health and water. So we, Madhu Khanna, David Zilmerman, myself, and Gal Hockeman, and a group of economists and myself have been writing different perspective pieces that they are under review. One is about to come out in high-profile journals, where we basically go beyond. First, we address, the bioeconomy is in the center there, as you see. But before you get into that, everything that we basically deal with in our life is impacted and can be impacted. Number one is political will. Political will decide whether things should be incentivized and should be changed. Political will impact health as a result of, people eating better food or, processing components of it. Health impacts environment, market, society. So it was necessary to bring this perspective together, how the different pieces connect, before we get into the more details, which is pre-production, processing, recycling. If you zoom in the center of the circular bioeconomy, now you have renewable non-food sources, and we have, as probably the BER, the Biology and Environmental Research Center of DOE, focuses on renewable products. We host one here, the Great Lakes GLBRC. Organic waste, gaseous waste, all go into the pre-production in order to obtain a really plethora of suites of alternative products, sustainable aviation fuels, materials from organic compounds, new chemical, biochar, and in the recycling bin, obviously you capture carbon and you store as much as possible. The other thing, just to expand this one more time further, we made this comparison between what a linear market economy does versus a circular economy. And you'll see, this pentagon basically has all the circles going into to be more positive and increase within circular bioeconomy for the reason that I've just showed, going from, equity consideration, just because what is the bottom line of these major changes is that the linear market economy is much more based on private interest, private economic well-being. And so you see that corner is more, it requires investment to transition from a linear economy to a circular bioeconomy. But after that, it's a win-win situation, because the person that will move into a circular bioeconomy will make enough, economic, but there is a feedback loop that even the person that is directly involved will benefit through indirect use, through the environment, and better quality of food, and so on. So this is very critical to address this transition that will occur in response to economic changes. And you can never exclude, this component into the analysis. And so I know probably the group here all agrees that change is inevitable, but, to see it implemented is much more, the implementation is much more complex. The barriers, it doesn't, we can make as much advancement in science, and some from the basic to even some of the applied, but some of the paradigm shift don't lead to translational research immediately. Here we're moving from, understanding microbial diversity, the opportunity of increasing, rotational high diversity crops into 4 health principles, what we all know as the regenerative ag, minimum disturbance, maximize soil cover, increase biodiversity and living roots and so on. But the innovative, still this approach, even though being proven at more academic or research scale, that takes time to be adopted. And so it's slow for the main reason, whether you agree or not, there is an economic component of it, as well as a time which relates to money as well. How much of an additional level of complexity we're adding to a system. And this complexity has to be somehow considered in terms of either rewarded from some level of incentives. Transdisciplinary partnership are key, and the system approach, the math, the complexity of the feedback needs to be basically the approach to be used in order to get this direct and indirect feedback to enable the change towards sustainability and circular bioeconomy. So this is a typical chart that we do, in capturing, quantifying the system. It's a system of systems. You have things operating within soil, plant, drying. And so if you isolate the different and you track them down, you have carbon, nitrogen, and water, and then you see the different colors, where does, the flow of carbon goes into and how much. And so through a system approach, whether it's, process-based model or combination of them, a multi-model ensemble, we work on capturing this feedback and track them down such that you see how much of that particular element is recycled, how much can be maximized, how inefficient it is, and so on. So one of the things that I work on is really the development of digital twins. And it isn't a fancier word now to say about modeling or crop modeling. It is a digital, right? It's a reproduction. It's a reproduction of reality on the computer. The difference is the digital twin captures much more the real world in an integrated way. So in our case, the digital twins are digital twins of farms and fields, which they cannot. A crop model alone is a reproduction of this, an hypothetical square meter of land that interacts with soil, plant, and it does all the process. But you need to capture where this multiple square meter, hundreds of thousands at the field scale interact all the way to the farms. And so it is important because it's a bridge between the physical and the digital world, and promotes innovation and performance because basically, you can ask the what-if scenarios before things are implemented. You can build confidence by reproducing the observation and improve performance. So it can be done to design new technologies as well as to see what is the probability and the fate of a change on a farm in the context of sustainability, both profitability and environmental impact. The statement down there, technology should not be considered. We cannot think of technology to be the only sole solution to have a major change, because we need transformational change. And so I make this example that I don't think it's very useful for me to design the most efficient way through a digital system to irrigate an alfalfa crop in Arizona. I would only legitimize the problem by continuing to irrigate areas where crops may not necessarily be most suitable land use in a desert. And so be able to have a transformational change, it's critical, and it's part of that transdisciplinary work. And I know it's complex, but I wanted to emphasize that even though I work a lot on developing technologies, integrating them, they can also help you design potential solutions, but you need to take a step back to basically analyze what could be even more transforming and what type of technology would serve that transformation. This is another example of how regenerative agriculture is implemented. This is an example of a large farm in Italy that is an example for using biodigester. There is a plan for USDA to invest heavily into, having biodigestion, digesters on farms and collecting manure, diverse rotation. In Europe, is allowed to harvest a crop between 2 food crops. And so they take the biomass, they take food scrap, they take manure, and they generate a significant amount of energy and credits, ETFs, the mandatory, the California requirement at $300 or so, rather than unfortunately the small cost of, more of a soil carbon based and natural solution. So this is becoming important on large scale farms where some of the energy is generated on the farm. And so you integrate crops with livestock energy to be able to be sold in the green, on the grid, and reuse the byproduct as a potential fertilizer. With all this is not a panacea, with all the issue that may be related in understanding how much of these elements return to the soil, where they can go spatially, if they have too much phosphorus in some areas versus another, but it's an important line of research as well as application. So one of the things that I've worked over the years is trying to understand spatial and temporal variability of crop yields. And so we've been able to scale this work of yield stability, which means, areas that they constantly produce high yielding versus areas they constantly produce low yielding, and areas that they fluctuate from one year to the next. This is using Landsat historical. Now we can do it with Planet at, daily images at 3 meters. So we have an understanding of basically the level of productivity within field, where different things, different scenarios could be used. Whether it's through variable rate technologies, where it's the most critical layer to be able to understand if you are in a high productive areas, you won't feed the plants. If you are in other low productivity areas, you don't want to feed the water or the environment, but rather either change land use or be able to reduce the input as much as possible. So you start bringing those concept of circularity there, increase economics by reducing environmental costs and inputs. So of the entire this analysis at scale for corn and soybean, so close to and this is the map for corn of 80 million, but we have for soybean. So we have this for every single field. This is not a projected, or these are real common land unit. So the areas within where each field is located. And so the subfield productivity showed that about close to 50%, 48% of within field is constantly high productivity. So it's kind of, basically adapted, and it's resilient in a way, independently of the weather condition. You have 25% that is constantly underperforming the mean of the field, and 27% that fluctuates from high to low, with 64% at the time is high yielding, and 26% is low yielding. So with different level of nitrogen use efficiency, we did thorough mass balance here of how much the amount of fertilizer that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico actually match what USDS, with the only difference we know where it comes from now. $700 million of US farmers' dollars gets wasted for fertilizer that is not used, and the amount of energy that is emitted, both as energy and CO2, was also calculated. We also have a knowledge of water deficit and excess water within the field, which are basically, again, one of the bases and baseline approaches to be able to be efficient in the way you manage your field. And so we have an understanding of that causes that level of instability in yields. The precision conservation approach for changing climate it's basically goes from, for that analysis, we're coming out with a paper that has never, I guess, to be so original in the sense that quantifying level of profitability at field scale. So we go from profitability map, which is a conversion of the cost, the total cost, versus the sales of, using different prices between corn and soybeans and all the other sales benefits. But you calculate profitability map that, knowing where you have areas of high productivity, where there is an optimal response versus areas where fertilizer should not be applied. And so increasing biodiversity is the main goal of those low productivity areas, basically replacing production of corn and using, pollinators, biodiversity, native prairies that have multiple use, multifunctional use, And so we're trying to push for a multifunctional field and farms that will lead to circular bioeconomy. The other benefits, it's not just getting greater yield from where you have a response that could even offset some of the indirect land use, but also because you can incentivize the adoption of these practices. And so this is implemented at the moment. We have an NRCS grant where we pay farmers, and we have several thousands of acres currently they're enrolled into what we call biodiversity conservation areas, and they get paid these incentives to remove corn, low productivity corn, for the replacement of pollinators. And so a farmer can make profit through incentives and payments eventually, because they build carbon through perennial system and building organic carbon. So this is an example on marginal land, the rate at which carbon can accumulate doing this change and changing land use of low productivity areas. So this is basically an example of what we give to farmers. This is instead of having a prescription maps, which we obviously do, the project is both biodiversity and variable rate. They get paid $10 an acre to do the variable rate in exchange of the as applied map. So we quantify the avoided emission through reduction of fertilizer application. And so these are the areas that over the last 15 years have always lost money. And the trigger is less than $15, but this, in the fields, it's more than $100 or so that farmers lose on each of the areas. Then they choose how much they want to do, they get paid, and so they implement examples. And I have photographs that unfortunately I didn't include in this presentation. So the other piece was, be able to lead towards this climate smart commodity investment that the farmer is doing. It's one part is through precision conservation, bringing the level of efficiency and circularity through that. But the other is going from the yield stability map to prescription maps. And then, as I mentioned, in response to the knowledge of how much is applied, you have avoided greenhouse gas emissions map, and then commodity premium that it could be basically allocated based on the cost of carbon of how much company wanting to. So we have a project on that, one of the climate smart commodities with one of the meals that is basically interested in paying farmers for climate smart practices return for avoided emissions. I think this may be my last slides, because I like to see what we're at in terms of questions and things that weren't clear. But I work on, the big piece of the circular bioeconomy, as I mentioned, obviously importance of understanding the profit behind technology. Digital agriculture can be designed from scratch. We talked about sensing crops through remote sensing, yield stability map, different scales of robotics, AI, and so all the big data occurring on the farm with the analysis of the profit. At the farm level tools, the yield stability that is actually also being used. There are 2 papers recently published for my group about using them to sample within the field based on yield stability. And so the low yielding areas always had lower amount of carbon. And so they're important to parameterize models, understand where you need to go back to see changes and impacts of different regenerative practices. And you can have certification, green labeling tools through satellite, be able to detecting tillage and cover crops. So profitability is so key, that lays in the middle. You can choose again to reduce avoided emissions or build carbon, enhancing biodiversity. We got tools to calculate trade-offs and energy efficiency, water quality, profitability, and help stakeholders make better decisions. We also thought about that this level of standardization could come based on different levels of adoption, reward farmers for the practice adoption, and then you work with companies to be able to quantify the outcome. But it's complex for a farmer to place all the burden that they will get paid only if they deliver the outcome, mainly because the outcome may take time and it will vary spatially, but we want practice adoption to be pervasive across the whole US and not just in places where, you know, then immediate outcome can be quantified. And so models play a critical role in there. And I work closely, you know, with the government recently to be able to help them making more sense of the impact of climate smart practices in terms of modeling the system through a multi-model ensemble instead of using one model, multiple models to capture a better representation of the reality. But it is important, and science and policy stakeholders come together so we can make all a better decision for our future. So this wanted to acknowledge, you know, my lab members and the funding sources that without investment, a lot of the good research will not be able to be done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, Bruno, thank you so much for that tremendous overview. Boy, a lot to unpack and digest, but some of the takeaways that really hit me every time I hear you speak is that there is no silver bullet here. This is about transformational change involving systems of systems and thinking much, much bigger than we have in the past, with the goal of managing not just a productivity goal or not just an environmental goal, or not just a climate or a biodiversity goal, but actually trying to manage these landscapes for concurrently delivering solutions across multiple objective areas. So thank you so much for reinforcing that. And right here, where we are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we're managing for those outcomes: nutrition security, water quality, biodiversity. The list goes on and on. Okay, I'm sure there's any number of questions that I would invite you either to raise your hand so I can see who has a question you'd like to propose, perhaps orally, or drop them into the chat box. And I know I've got a couple, but I'm going to go right to Pat Stuntz, who already has dropped a question into our chat box. And she says, while elements of this systems approach are being studied and refined, is there a goal to get funding to evaluate and demonstrate proof of concept in the US? So, Bruno, how would you answer that?
Yes. So as much I can talk about it, I know the investment that has been made within the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, a big chunk of this investment goes through the office, through NRCS, the chief economist. And so there are different parts of the system, which is basically improve. I see Michelle Cavigelli here, you know, the improvements of N2O quantification and emissions, improvement of sampling and having more continuous sampling scheme for soil organic carbon changes under the different practices. I'm involved on the model improvement and, you know, multi-model ensemble. So that chunk of money is basically available to demonstrate this proof of concept that follow the climate smart commodities. Climate smart commodities where $3.2 billion were invested, mostly public with public-private, actually mostly private, because initially it was $1 billion investment that with the matching funds became 3.2. And the majority of that funding goes to pay farmers to implement practices. At the same time, this is the best opportunity we could have to sample at time 0, time 5, 10, and so on. And so becomes even beyond the proof of concept. The problem is you can't sample everywhere, so there's still a limited number of acreage that where all these practices, but this will provide an incredible, you know, amount of opportunities, data set for improving models and testing models of this climate smart commodities implementation. So the funding is from the IRA allocated strictly for that. I'm also aware of a large investment on the philanthropic side of decarbonizing the economy within the agricultural system and circular bioeconomy. So it is the right time to be able to tackle these questions, and working together with different groups is certainly the key rather than having a single solution. As Ernie, you couldn't say a better synthesis is, it isn't just about, okay, I'm doing no-till, so I'm good. No, it's a combination. There is never enough emphasis on changing rotations and bringing all the other pieces into the system. And again, we're focusing on the production systems because, you know, the man-made system, the transformation, the packaging, and that is a little bit ahead. I mean, there are so much investment going into that, you know, how much more efficient we have got. And so a lot of the emission reduction comes from that, but there is still a big chunk that we need to reduce within our production system. Soils is more than, you know, 80% of the emission in ag come from N2O. So it's important to be able to manage resources short and long term, you know, but without accounting for leakages, you know, changes in yield and much reductions. So that's the complexity of how you deal with fertilizer. And my answer to that will be just you deal wherever the fertilizer is needed. You don't put it where it's not needed. And that concept is, I guess, becoming more and more. Which philanthropies? I mean, I'm aware of a big investment now from Smith's Future, for example. And then obviously the Earth Fund, you know, the basis, hundreds of millions invested in this.
Amy has a question. Amy, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Bruno. I really appreciate you giving the presentation today. It's really great stuff. I have a question about, you mentioned, you showed the one slide that was where the non-profitable acres were. I think in purple you showed them. And with that project, are you showing the farmers that map and then trying to get them to convert some of that purple area to pollinator habitat? I'm curious how it's going. Like what's the reaction you're getting? Like, yes, that aligns with the areas I think aren't profitable, and I'm willing to take out all of them, or I'm willing to take out a small part of them, or like, yeah, how's that playing out?
So, Amy, it's a very relevant question because, first of all, when we engage in the conversation, yes, that's the first output that they get from the analysis. And they said, oh, this is fantastic. The map itself, like this, always puzzles them and says, oh, this much areas, I don't recall. Then whenever they see the numbers, I haven't shown the slides with the number because I really didn't know how much time we wanted to allocate to my talk. But these areas lose $200 per acre on average. I mean, it's a significant loss. And so then the conversation turns into a moment of pride, or, you know, things that, you know, no, that's not right. And then they realize they slowly basically either accept, you know, the first time, or not accepting, and then, you know, dealing with it. In the end, those areas, the way we project them are never the same. They're always reduced. And this is a psychological thing that says, but okay, why are you reducing them if I'm paying you? While I've shown that you're losing money. So you're basically making $300, not, I give you $100, it's actually more than that, it's $150, it's more than the CRP payment. And so I give you this and you avoid $200. So a real corn growers or large farms always, which is basically part of the gene, I think, of being a farmer, they always think that that can always get better. You know, it's like they manage the land for the perfect year. And only recently, when the yield maps have been integrated into an historical perspective, because they only, if you see the yield map from the year before, that's as far as the memory goes. You know, they never, and even if you put them on the fridge, first of all, they're lost for the historical. So when you start putting them, all these maps together, then you really understand the level of, you know, changes that there is really needed. So in the end, the reality is that there is a negotiation phase where it tends to be a reduction on the areas, but they're willing to do, because it's the nature of the farmers. They want to see and test. They want to see how the, you know, the pollinator is going. There are concerns on, or will the pollinators, you know, spread into the fields? Will I get a field full of weeds? And some things that didn't occur to me after, you know, a few years now into talking to them, it says, oh, my landlord doesn't want to see weeds. He says, if he sees weeds, if he sees weeds in my field, he's going to not renew the license, you know, basically the lease. And you probably know the percentage, 67% of US land is leased. So that makes a significant, important question to ask is if some of the farmers, until we also make this as part of the beneficial for the landlord to be able to give them. And so USDA is actually tackling that problem, but no one will invest in an apartment for major renovation if you know your lease may be expiring next year. So there is that piece of that. So long answer, but it's a negotiation and then they implement to see what it would like, what it would be. There is the last uncertainty for them is also livestock. Deer damage or wildlife damage. Will they go in more? And so to answer that, we have a new project where we have a time-lapse camera along all the edges of the BCAs and several fields across Michigan, and we're seeing, when the deers come in. They're afraid. It's one thing talking to the experts of this is deers don't feel comfortable living in the forest too much, and so they may not reach inside that. That's an hypothesis that we're testing, and so all these questions are legitimate, I guess, for a farmer, but initially for us to say, what? Why are you cutting? Why are you cutting short on this? I'm paying you for that, and it goes the other way around. Anyway, there is a psychology there that economists come with this rational, again, and I tease them, say, we make rational decisions. No, we do not make rational decisions.
So Bruno, another question, finance mechanisms are going to be key to accelerating this transformation towards circular bioeconomies. Are you having conversations with lending institutions, with commercial bankers, as an example? We have a question about that.
Yeah. The only interaction that I have is with Rabobank, but that's for carbon credits. That's for carbon, getting. So there is, I've been interacting. Lawrence Group is a group that wants to buy land and want to know where the poor lands are or where. So there is a lot of interesting, because of this technology is so applicable to different things. I don't necessarily have talked to the banks to say, hey, how can we remove this land you can pay off? Each of these interaction came for almost a different purpose, but they are coming, and a big piece also the insurance, the reinsurance people.
Okay, thank you. Puneet, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. Bruno, thank you for a great presentation. The question I have is, although farmers would lose money on the land that is in production and stuff like that, but if you take out all that land from production, looking from the production side of it, what impact that would have on the availability of a certain commodity and how that might impact the market and stuff like that, and and what the consumer might be paying for higher prices and all that. Have you thought about all that?
Yes, of course. That's a critical piece of our analysis. So to rephrase the question, if we remove this land, you're going to be, the area that I've shown of low productivity areas is about, for the US Midwest for corn, is about 25 to 30 million acres that they constantly lose money in. And so if you remove that amount from the production, the first question to ask, what is the yield of these areas? So it's not the same yield of the high productivity. Right? So it's less than half. So it's in the 100 bushel. So the indirect land use of 30 is already, so of 25 million acres, let's say it's already converted down back to 10, 13 or so. The other way of looking at it, we are witnessing yield increase from high productivity areas. So you can offset by increasing yield where there is a response. And that's, you got to use all these bits to do this global analysis. But if you consider where corn is used, 40% it goes to biofuel. That land, and you probably have seen the Road to Removal report, which I played a critical role in running biodiversity, not pollinators, bioenergy crops on low productivity areas, including the low and stable within this. Basically, you can use that, the prairies and harvest them to be converted into potential, biofuels. So that will be even less than zero indirect land use if we incentivize that level of adoption. So Same thing is for, grain. The rest, 38% goes for feed. You can have a piece of it go to grassland as it is going, I mean, to rotational grazing. And so the immediate thing is not necessarily an issue, but it has to be tackled. It's a proper concern. The most concern is if the corn prices change, farmers will go back, and revert and re-emit some of the land. But this is similar to the CRP land, where, people saying CRP should be going back, to production. That would be a mistake, because we got to be able to store carbon, be able to do things there, increase, and that will be, and it's staying, it's pretty stable. And at the acreage, actually, there was a greater demand. So I think the answer is multiple, right? It's like, it's important thing to understand that it isn't one-to-one conversion, because these are low yielding areas. And so even if the possible indirect use would be very small percentage, but not the 20% of the yield that basically the grains, they are no longer into the market.
Thank you, Bruno.
So Bruno, this is complex. And when I think about in Maryland, our primary target audience, it's the farmers that are utilizing the landscape to earn a living, to support their families and their communities, and to do so in a way that also gives back. So if we're trying to transition from this linear approach to farming to a more circular approach, what we keep coming back to is the notion of farmer to farmer learning and knowledge sharing. Now, they certainly will rely on all of the resources that are out there, but at the end of the day, farmers watch other farmers. They trust other farmers. So as you've been having conversations about circular systems with farmers around the country, what's been your experience on or around their ability to transfer knowledge and to be catalysts for adoption with their peers? How do you utilize them? And is it first and foremost the hook of they're more profitable, they have more on-farm retained value, so it's what's in it for them as opposed to what's in it for the world or the Chesapeake Bay or all these externalities? Talk to us a little bit about scaling this through farmers.
I have a bit of experience on this, because all this work is also part of different networks that have a pretty strong social economic analysis, components and field days, and a lot of other media. Okay, the interesting thing, and I don't want to offend anyone in general, is farmers are like little kids. They first are not necessarily, first there is a competition out there. I don't think it's natural to say that they won't say lies of saying, okay, this, but they never give all the secrets out. That is a given. You can cite me for that. And farmers say that. And so they don't necessarily want to see the neighbor that goes by and says, this guy is crazy, but he keeps looking at him or she, and then learn, how the distribution is always the same. You got the early adopters are the one they call me. And they say, hey, Bruno, I've seen you doing this and that. I got a message from a farmer says, are you aware of this technology that basically generates liquid fertilizer and does all that? And he says, can I come and talk to you way ahead of the game? And so they don't necessarily, so the second bit is the one that wait and watch. They don't want to try on their own scheme. The problem about having farmers only teaching other farmers is that it will take very little for a farmer, as it has happened, that goes in a coffee shop and says, don't do cover crops. I was trying to do this and my tractor got stuck. I had to call the guy that needed to come and fix. And so now, whether that is right, that doesn't mean that a single mistake or something that wasn't going right will impact, because some of the other farmers may take that as a lesson, and it's not a good lesson. It's a shortcut of something that may not necessarily help them on the long run. And so it is important that they need to be trained to see what we can show with evidence and with the results, coupled with their own feedback and saying, okay, if that person told me, yeah, oh, I couldn't do that, says, yeah, that's a case because many others can. But if that message was around, all the county will not be planting cover crop because a person said, you know, I'm not doing it, you know, for this reason. So there is a danger. The other thing is, even though I work and I'm always on their side, on the farmers, because someone that takes, first of all, you know, produces the food and everything, takes the risk and their job is dependent on the weather, it's pretty courageous, right? And so it's very important to understand where they sit and what they do. At the same time, people don't realize how complex, you know, managing a farm is, but also how much overrated they are in thinking that they know their farms. And you'll say, what? Yeah, they don't. They do not know their farm. First, because the fields rotate. They don't always lease the same field. Second is too big. You will not be able to know exactly where these low spots are unless you have an enterprise, that you have someone like me or an agronomist that look at the yield maps and this proper analysis. Farming is basically go, you got a time, you got a window, you do the best you can within that time frame. So it is complex. But so this digital technology is basically makes them jump out of the chair because it's what they really want to see, because they know they can't manage on efficiently an entire farm. They wish they know which field do I start with, and they could, and it will make a big difference if you know the level of, you know, probability of ponding or level of humidity that you can go in the field without making a mistake. So you mixing all the, you know, a wet field versus another. So any predictive analytics based on process-based model, not just on AI, that is based on the data that you get, can transfer to another field. It's important. So to answer your question, Annie, I think I've given you multiple answers, but they know, you know, what works on their place, but sometimes it's way more complex for their own understanding, and the decisions are made with sometimes either is in intuition, a little bit of experience, obviously, but this technology is key for them to do the transition. The what if scenarios and having it feel, that's the request I get more. Can I know, first of all, now the new question, you probably know this, can you tell me my carbon score? That's the new thing. It's just like, what's my carbon score? I say, why do you want to know your carbon score? Okay, sustainable aviation fuels, the oil companies pay them if reduction of 1% of the carbon score that is calculated, unfortunately not correctly because it's one number nationally, with all the practices in management nationally or whatever that is, 1% reduction pays them $368 per acre. But they got to show the adoption of the practices and the, you know, new addition. Anyway, it's complex. So they come to me because they want to know the avoided emissions if they do something and how much carbon can be stored if they adopt no-till and cover crops. And so on a long term and how long it takes depending on their climate. So things are converging towards this change. And so it's been great for this administration to invest so much into promoting and priming the change. But we need to continue to make advancements in both improving measurements for, you know, identifying location where models can then be scaled, because it's another thing you need to understand. It is impossible to measure everywhere. Some practices, you know, some variables even more than others. Forget about measuring N2O, you know, good everywhere. So you have to rely on systems, and the better this system are built with good data, the better, you know, we're off for the future. So it's really an integration of science and disciplines and people.
Well, Bruno, we are at time. I want to thank you on behalf of everyone on the webinar, on behalf of the Hughes Center Board of Directors, for taking your time to share this work with us. This is exciting, and we have decided that we were going to begin this conversation today with an eye towards how can we expand it within the state of Maryland? How can we draw more people into this conversation about the transition towards a more circular bioeconomy. You've given us plenty of fodder to reflect upon, to act upon, and we will be, I'm sure, following up with you in the coming months here as we grow this conversation across the state of Maryland. And if anything we've learned, we have to keep farmers at the center of these discussions, because if not, then it's just all of us talking heads talking about farmers as opposed to helping farmers experiment, discover new pathways, learn from each other, and become more sustainable, more resilient, and more profitable at the end. So thank you again to Kate Everett and the Hughes team. Thank you for setting this up. I believe we've recorded this, so we'll be making this available not just to those that have registered for the webinar, but we'll put this to good use as we go forward talking to other audiences. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and look forward to more conversations about the circular bioeconomy in agriculture and food systems. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.